Today, class, we're going to talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities. So when we think about taking care of patients in a nursing home, what we've been learning how to do in our CNA class, we think about our elderly population, and that is really not the case. It's just really disabilities that are going to put a person into a nursing home, whether it's an intellectual or developmental type of disability, or whether it's a disability that's happened from a car crash or a stroke at a young age. Those are things that are going to put a person in a nursing home. It's usually the disabilities more than the age that's going to play a factor. You'll see some nursing homes where we've got patients that have had major head traumas, for instance, and they can no longer care for themselves, and they're only in their 20s or 30 years old, and yet they're living in a nursing home because of it. So we are going to be looking at some intellectual disabilities. So one of the first ones we're going to look at here is mental retardation, which is a type of intellectual disability where our intellectual function, when we're talking about intellectual function, we're talking about it relating to learning, thinking, and reasoning. So intellectual disabilities can be defined as an IQ or an intelligence quotient score below 70 to 75. So when a person has an IQ of less than 70, usually they do tend to have a limit in at least one adaptive behavior of their ability their skills to be able to live, to work, or to play. So if you have an IQ of less than 70, you're looking at generally these people can still function quite well in some areas, but in other areas, they won't have that ability to be able to care for themselves completely. When we're looking at mental retardation, the condition usually will present before 18 years of age. And the other thing we have to remember is just because a person's disabled, whether it's an intellectual disability or a physical disability, we always have to remember that patients and residents are always entitled to the same rights everyone else is as well. So if we're thinking about where is the average person with an IQ, I mean, we're saying if an IQ less than 70, 75, they'll usually have some kind of intellectual disability where they can't function on their own. Generally, for most people, around 100 is average. Okay, so 70% of your population is going to be between 85 and 115. So it is something that just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about an IQ of being less than 70. Another disability is Down syndrome. Now, Down syndrome is a common cause of mild to moderate intellectual disability. So there is always going to be some intellectual component to the Down syndrome child. It is caused by an error in cell division, and an extra 21st chromosome is present. So a Down syndrome child generally has certain features caused by that extra chromosome. So a small head, short wide neck, a flattened nose, small ears, wide stubby fingers. Those are kind of physical characteristics that we see with a lot of our children with Down syndrome. And they may have other health issues as well. Now, many of our Down syndrome children are very high functioning. Okay, some can be extremely high functioning. So people with Down syndrome, they may need help with speech and language. Physical and occupational therapy may get involved with them. They generally will need health and sex education. They can be very trusting and can be easily manipulated as they get older into sexual activity. A healthy diet and regular exercise is also important. Fragile X syndrome is an inherited intellectual disability where the body doesn't make the necessary proteins needed for brain development. Symptoms are more pronounced in girls generally than they are in boys, but physically what you generally see is long ears, long faces, joints that are extremely loose and flexible, some behavioral problems, and speech issues. Now, this one is not as common as Down syndrome. Down syndrome is one of our more common intellectual disabilities that we'll see. Autism. Autism begins in early childhood. Usually it gets diagnosed by about 3 years of age, and there's a a broad spectrum of autism, from children that are extremely high functioning, to children that really struggle to be able to, they have a lot of problems with social skills and communication skills. So there's a big broad range of the type of patient you're going to see with this, but it is a brain disorder, and unfortunately it has no cure at this time. So children with autism generally, again, problems with social skills, verbal and nonverbal communication problems, repetitive behaviors and routines, narrow interests, and a lot of times they get sensory overload. Their brains just cannot take in a lot of sensation or stimulus from a lot of different areas. Autism is more common in boys than it is in girls, and they really don't know the cause of it. Genetics have been tested, environmental factors may be involved, but there is no specific cause that they've been able to say that this is why it happens. With therapy, the person that can usually learn to change or control their behaviors, and so there's a lot of you know, therapies that go into play with this to try to make them as highly functional as possible. The person needs to develop social and work skills. And people with autism may have other disorders. They may have intellectual disabilities, or sometimes they have seizures. There's been a link with a lot of kids that have autism end up having seizure disorders. That's not the true for all cases, but it has been linked to it. I liked this. It was autism, always unique, totally interesting, sometimes mysterious. I thought that was a really nice acronym for it. Another type of intellectual disability we see is cerebral palsy. It is a term that's applied to a group of disorders involving muscle weakness or poor muscle control. The defect is in the motor region of the brain, and it tends to cause abnormal movements. The child can have abnormal posturing and coordination problems. It usually occurs, it can actually start in the womb before birth, or it can happen during birth, or within a few years after birth before they'll actually see signs of it. But causes include lack of oxygen to the brain or brain defects from faulty brain development. And unfortunately, there is not a cure for CP. Care needs to depend on the degree of brain damage. So disabilities and impairments can range from being very mild, where the child still seems really high functioning, to very severe, where they are basically dependent. So the goal is always, of course, to try to help the child learn how to become as independent as they possibly can be. Spina bifida is a defect in the spinal cord, and the defect usually occurs during the first month of pregnancy. So with spina bifida, the vertebrae do not actually form properly, and so it leaves a split in the vertebrae, which leaves the spinal cord unprotected. So the lower back is the most common site of it, and so the treatment's going to depend on the type of spina bifida. So there's what we call spina bifida occulta, okay, and or there is the meningeal spina bifida with a meningeal seal, where so here the spinal cord it's maybe weakened, but it's still actually encased. Okay, so these people usually, sometimes it doesn't even get picked up right away. This, with the meningeal seal, there is the space in the spinal cord, and part of the spinal cord outpouches. Okay, and so that is actually fairly easy to treat. They can usually remove that, and they can sew this up. And then there's a myelomeningeal seal, where not only does the spinal cord basically outpouch here, but the spinal column outpouch here, but the spinal cord itself is in there. And this one is actually much more dangerous, obviously, because if they try to remove that, they can actually damage and get the spinal cord in there. Hydrocephalus is a disease that we see where the cerebrospinal fluid collects in and around the brain, and it frequently happens with spina bifida. So sometimes these kids with spina bifida end up having hydrocephalus as well. And the head enlarges because it's filling up with cerebrospinal fluid. It's not draining properly through the body like the spinal fluid is supposed to. So the head enlarges and the pressure inside the head increases and compresses the rest of the brain, which causes damage to it. So intellectual disabilities or mental retardation and neurological damage can occur if this isn't treated right away. And so it's one of the reasons why anytime, if you guys have had kids, you go for your routine, child visit or your 3-month wellness check, and every time you go into the doctor, they're going to measure the circumference of the head for the first couple of years because they want to make sure it's not enlarging too fast or that it's not enlarging inappropriately. Because if you do have that spinal fluid leaking in there, it can surgically be fixed and corrected. But if you let it go too long where it puts that pressure on the rest of the brain cells, then you can end up having permanent damage. So what they do is they put a shunt. A shunt is placed in the brain to allow that cerebral spinal fluid to drain from the brain, and then they usually just put the shunt into the abdominal area, so that cerebral spinal fluid will just go ahead and leak out. Some potential problems that kids with spina bifida, with hydrocephalus have are vision problems, seizures, and some learning disabilities. And that is just a quick overview. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about a lot of the different intellectual things that happen with our kids. That is something as you go on in your nursing career, you'll learn in a lot more detail. Because generally as a nursing assistant, that is not what you are going to be taking care of. That's not generally the type of patient that you'll be working with as a general rule. So we were just going to give you a brief introduction into it.